Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I'm a professor at the Department for Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, where I'm speaking from today. So it's important to start with the fact that the University of British Columbia is located on the unceded territories of the Musqueam indigenous people. So they asked us to talk about that a little bit before we open any conversation. And the Musqueam people are speakers of the Ho'okame'an language, and they are the ancestral custodians of this land. I think it's also important to start with another land acknowledgement. This one comes from Brazil, and one of the communities that I work with, also a community related to my mom's side of the family. And they've asked me to do an acknowledgement that consists of 4 different layers. So first we acknowledge the land as a living entity and as something that sponsors life and the metabolism that we're also part of. It's not a resource, it's not property. The second acknowledgement is that for us to be able to talk today and for the gathering to take place, this is based on a system that is also based on violence and unsustainability. So we have to bring to this gathering and the conversation the responsibilities and accountabilities that come with having our lives underwritten by colonialism and by violence of different types. The third acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of the people who have made this possible and the other entities that have made us talking possible. And in this sense, I need to acknowledge Irma for inviting me and say that I'm really grateful and honored to be part of your gathering. We also acknowledge the people who we have left at home that enable us to be talking today. And we also acknowledge the other entities that are part of the gathering, like in this case the computers and the places where the minerals for the computers have been taken from, and the communities in these relationships, as well as the people who are going to feed you, for example, during the time you are together. So we acknowledge all of that and bring all of that to the table. And the last acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that we're all relatives. It's a big family, it's a big metabolic family consisting of human beings and non-human beings, and we're all part of it. And in that sense, we also acknowledge our ancestors that have brought us together. And ancestors are not only those who have come before, but also those yet to come. So we bring to the table the responsibility we have that what we talk about today is going to have a good impact on those who come after us. So after all these acknowledgements, I'm going to talk today to you about the work of an arts and research collective called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, which is the title of the presentation. And I'll just go through different pictures and a few of the points of the collective and some explanations, some ideas that may or may not be useful for the work that you are doing, but that give you a glimpse of the kinds of things we are doing together. I will also show you at the end a few of the resources that we have available for free on the website, because what we do is, of course, Creative Commons. And if you're interested in this kind of work, you're very welcome to engage with the materials and then contact us at a later point. So our collective works at the interface of 2 big sets of questions. On the one hand, we have questions related to systemic, historical, and ongoing violence. And on the other hand, we have questions related to unsustainability, including the climate emergency, biodiversity loss, economic instability, and even a global mental health crisis. So generally, people who work with historical, systemic, and ongoing violence do not work with questions of unsustainability to a great extent, and vice versa. And what we're trying to do is bring these concerns together. Now, our collective, the work of the collective, the research specifically, more specifically, is based on post-colonial, decolonial, critical race theory, and indigenous studies literature. But most importantly, it's also based on the work with communities in high-intensity struggle in Latin America. And the practices of this community are much more important than the literature. So a lot of what these communities are doing cannot be transcribed or translated back into text, and there are several reasons for that, and we acknowledged it in order to also put forward the argument that we can't interrupt our ways of being in this world by reading a book. Basically, there are things that need to happen in the body, that there are things that have to happen in the land, there are things that have to happen in between us and within us that books can gesture towards, but they cannot mobilize necessarily, right? So the communities that we work with, and I'll talk more about that later, have shown us that there's much more work. Intellect is important for sure, and probably it's 20% of the work, but there's 80% that is effective, that is relational, that is to do with cycles of life and death, that is to do with the land. And that also needs to be, we also need to pay attention to that. And our obsession with reading and writing and just getting this down on paper might be an obstacle to understanding that the problems that we're facing are not problems of information and knowledge, but problems related to a deeply ingrained, harmful habit of being. So that's part of what we're trying to do. So we work with lots of social cartographies. This is one of them. Social cartographies are visual representations that help mobilize conversations in a different way. So we use, one of the cartographies we use is the house that modernity built, that talks about a planet with a house built on top of it, and the house is exceeding the limits of the planet. This house has a foundation of separability, the perceived separation between humans and what we call nature. Then there is one carrying wall of universal reason, which is related to a single story of human progress, development, evolution, or civilization. Then there is the other carrying wall of the nation state, which is what creates borders and separates us into groups, but always remembering from critical race theory that the nation state was actually created to protect property, and the protection of people through the granting of rights only happens when there is interest convergence between the protection of property and the protection of people. And of course, also thinking about the work of other authors like Padurai or Benedict Anderson, for example, thinking about the fiction of the communities that the nation state creates and how this mediates our relationships with the world. So we have this knowledge fiction that then becomes a filter for how we relate to other people and to the land. And then there's the roof of global capital. Today, this is the roof of global financial shareholder capitalism, but there have been other roofs before, and people have tried other roofs, but the structure, for example, of socialism or even anarchism, of separability, universal reason, in the nation states in different forms remain the same. And this is the structure of the house that modernity built. And what we see today is that there's structural damage in the house, and we are faced with several different kinds of crises, socioeconomic, political, ecological, and we have to ask ourselves, do we fix the house? Do we expand the house? Do we build another house? Are there other types of shelter? Can we live without the house? So these kinds of concerns and questions are questions that we engage with the collective. And part of our work is more to articulate it and see and map the responses than to try to offer an answer. We are engaged in practices, of course, that point to different horizons and directions, but the main pedagogical aim of the collective is to open up difficult conversations in ways that ground relationships so that relationships do not fall apart. when these difficult conversations come to the fore. And so the pedagogical aim, rather than providing a normative direction, is normative in the sense of us needing to go deeper and relating wider in this context as we face the global challenges that we need to face together. So, as part of the house cartography, we also have the modern subjectivity. So within the house modernity built, there's also the subjectivity that modernity built that represents the kind of grammar of reasoning that the house makes us normalize within ourselves. So here's box head, the square head on top of a very, very small body. And in the frame of box head, you have certain words that make things intelligible. So we're saying here that, for example, dialectical thinking, utility maximizing thinking, logocentric, evolutionary, teleological, universalist, allochthonic, and anthropocentric thinking are the tenets that ground intelligibility in modern reasoning. So here you have dialectical being this thing about the search for a synthesis or progress in an argument. So you have a thesis and antithesis, and then you have this desire for a synthesis. In this way of thinking, paradox, it's very difficult to hold paradoxes. Paradoxes become something that we're trying to avoid. Utility maximizing is about maximizing utility, so we play with it saying I benefit, therefore I'll do it. Logocentric thinking is the thinking that thinks that we can index reality so that we can control it. We index reality in language, therefore we can control it, so we put the world in a box. Evolutionary thinking sees box head as the apex of evolution, of the humankind. Universalist is the idea that we can have a single story that encompasses everything. Teleological is about a linear path that sees the end already, and the idea of working together, planning to an end that we can already see. Allochthonic comes from critical race theory that sees modern forms of subjectivity ahead in time, and generally white forms of subjectivity ahead in time, and racialized forms, they are back in time. So it connects this understanding of progress with an idea of being ahead in time, and other groups of people with different understandings of time and of progress, they are perceived to be behind, not yet catching up to the present moment. And then anthropocentric, of course, is centering human exceptionalism and separating humankind from the other animals, the other species, the plants, and the land itself. So this is what makes box head powerful within the house of modernity, and these are the things that make arguments intelligible. So here we're saying that if you are trying to make an argument that is not dialectical, utility maximizing, or logocentric, you're probably going to be rendered unintelligible to institutions like this, like the university. Even when you're trying to challenge one of these things, generally you have to reproduce another one. So the arguments become very circular. And there's a lot beyond box head that box head cannot put in the box. And these things are perceived to be worthless or even non-existent. So the work of Boaventura de Souza Santo, for example, talks about this with using a different metaphor, but it's about what's visible and normal and real. It needs to fit the box. What doesn't fit the box is non-existent and can be either extracted from the outside and put inside the box, a piece of it, or it needs to be destroyed because it's perceived as a threat. So Boaventura de Souza Santos calls this idea of destroying what is perceived to be worthless as epistemicide. So we destroy other ways of thinking and being that do not fit this box as an act of epistemicide. Now, there are two ways of looking at this picture. One is that there's a box and an outside and an inside the box, but there's also another way that asks us to look at this box as a line that draws a box. And in this way, I think it's more interesting to think about box head as part of our psyche, of every one of us. If you've been socialized in education, it's part of our psyche, and it has a few functions that he can perform very well. But if it is the only thing we have, then it is problematic. So I usually say, like, if you're going to build a plane, it's good to use your box head. But if you're going to build a relationship, that's not the right part, we talk about people in the bus. It's not the right passenger to call to do for that task, right? So there is this idea that we're more than box head, much more than box head, but we have been reduced to it because our way of being reduces being to knowing, and this kind of knowing specifically. And that now has brought us into a situation where maybe extinction is just at the corner, right? So we will have to figure out what has been exiled. We talk about exiled capacities, and learn from Boxhead as a teacher what it has to teach us about its own limitations. So Boxhead is not a pathology to be demonized or trashed. Boxhead is a teacher. That way of drawing of the line is drawing something that is important for us to learn with and from. So this idea of not being an exclusionary approach to things. It's not about either inside or outside of the box, but both and more. Understanding it from a different perspective, taking a step back, is part of what the collective is trying to do, and how to integrate both what is perceived to be good and bad and get out of these categories, but thinking about the lessons, integrating the lessons learned from repeated mistakes so that we can make only different mistakes in the future. That's part of what this collective is trying to do. So what we see today is that there's a storm coming because the crises are going to intensify because the house is both violent and unsustainable. And so the house is starting to come for a storm is forming with several rain bands. It's a perfect storm forming. Some people in the world are already facing the storm as a category 4 and 5 hurricane. Some people are experiencing it at categories 1 to 3. Generally, if you're category 1 to 3, you experience just one of the rain bands, one of the winds, and we are taught to really turn your back and run away from it, right? Because we don't know how to deal with the storm. And the storm is threatening truth and morality, for example, on one of the carrying walls based on universal reasons. It's threatening the rule of law, rights, and order. It's threatening mental health. It's threatening social mobility. It's threatening food and water security, housing and healthcare security. It's threatening the status of the people who are living in the penthouse of the house. And this idea, this promise of unlimited enjoyment and consumption. And it shows that if we treat the earth as unlimited resource and put our sewage down to it, at one point the sewage will come to the house itself, right? So how do we face the storm together is another question that we've been talking about quite a lot. And working as people from other movements also start asking these questions and ask us to get involved. So working with people from Extinction Rebellion or Deep Adaptation and other social movements, basically to sit together, try to map, try to clarify what the different layers of the challenges and the complexities are, so that we can approach the storm in a good way. So in that sense, we've been talking about turning ourselves into a buffalo, because there's a story here in the prairies, and it's an indigenous story told to us by Chief Moon, that when there is a storm in the prairies, which is a flattened surface, the body of the buffalo becomes a liability. So depending on how the buffalo is standing, it's going to be buried in the snow and die. So what the buffaloes know is that they have to head towards the storm. They have to align with the wind, one of the strongest winds, and they have to put all their weight in the front part of their body, put their head down, and walk. They can't be still, otherwise they're going to die. So we're using this as a metaphor to talk about how the crisis and the force of the storm in the house is actually going to offer us an opportunity to shapeshift into a buffalo so that we can face the storm and find another way of existing together. And this means that there are certain things we'll have to do. So number one would be building stamina for this, because we are extremely fragile within the house. We're actually quite infantilized within the house. But we need to build stamina to be able to stay with the storm, not run away from it, not face away from it. We need to be able to dig deeper, relate wider, and connect the dots. We need to be able to layer reality and see the paradoxes and complexities of things. And we need to recalibrate our vital compass. So the vitality that comes for us to continue to walk needs to be actually calibrated with the storm itself. We need to find another way of being, basically, that would be based more on accountability and gratitude than on entitlements and exceptionalism, for example. And we can talk more about this later if you're interested in that. But the buffalo has become an important metaphor for the work that we do. And generally, that's what we use to talk about what we need to do together. So we need to stay with the storm. And in order to do that, we need to build stamina, dig deeper, relate wider, layer reality, and recalibrate our vital compass. We also use the metaphor of mycelium and mushrooms to talk about this process of the storm. So the storm represents both the process of something dying and something being born. And our role is to hospice what's dying and assist with the birth of what's being born without suffocating it. So in relationship to this birth, we have the metaphor of mycelium and mushrooms. So generally when we talk about justice, ecological justice or economic justice, we just want to put down in a piece of paper in a policy what this should look like and think that that will be enough for this to be implemented. That's the general idea, right? But this metaphor challenges that and says that it's like mycelium and mushroom. Mycelium is the substrata where mushrooms spring from if that substrata is healthy, right? So we say that, and this is coming from indigenous practices, that without cognitive justice, affective justice, and relational justice, there's no ecological or economic justice. When we presented this back to the indigenous communities, they said we don't want to use the word justice because the word justice means kind of, again, a teleological thing that we arrive at the point. What we're talking about here is actually healing and well-being. So without cognitive healing and well-being, affective our emotions, and this is all about the unconscious, right? Emotions are not just what you can think about. It's everything that has been bottled up in that box, right, that you don't want to open. So unless we declutter that, because it's also from that box that we connect with a wider biointelligence, right, without looking at our shadow, working through our shadow, and composting our shit, our individual shit. We can't do this together. Basically, we're going to keep producing the same mistakes and the same cycles and the same circularities. Relational well-being and relational healing is about collective shit. Like there's a lot of historical collective shit we need to compost together, and we need a party to do that because nobody would want to do that without a party. So relational justice is about learning to relate beyond the filters that have been given to us in terms of nation states, for example, or the idea that we can only relate to what we know. We already relate to everything anyway, all the time. We're part of the same metabolism. How do we shed this desire for knowing before we can relate and realize that we relate in unknowability? So we relate already beyond identity, beyond knowledge, beyond understanding. There are other senses that are being affected. There's more to me relating already to you than what I'm conscious of. So how do we tap into these capacities in order to create better, deeper, more resilient relationships where we are not enmeshed into each other, but we are not individuals either. We are entangled, right? And in entanglement, we have both freedom and responsibility and accountability, very, very well grounded there. And then in that sense, ecological and economic justice are just the outcomes of that, the natural outcomes of that. And it means that we are calibrated within a bigger metabolism. We're flowing with that flow in a healthy way. And therefore, nutrients are being distributed in a good way. And life can continue. Life can continue to be sponsored. So that's one of the metaphors we use. We also work a lot with the idea of the unconscious. We do that through a non-Western form of psychoanalysis. Western psychoanalysis is usually about meaning and narrative, and also body. Indigenous forms of psychoanalysis of dealing with the unconscious are usually land-based and involve sometimes interaction with plants. But through that work, those practices, we have come to talk about denial. Also the work of Gayatri Spivak and people like Homi Bhabha, Edward Said, they were Lacanians, it's Western psychoanalysis, and we borrow from that work as well. But the four denials we talk about, four modern denials, the denials within the house are the denials of violence, the denial that everything we have is based on expropriation, exploitation, extraction, and destruction. The denial of the limits of the planet, the idea that this is not, like there's a limit to it, how much we can do this. And that, for example, exponential growth in a linear planet, it's not going to work. Then there's the denial of entanglement, the denial that we're part of a wider metabolism that is biointelligent, and the denial of the magnitude of the problem. So a lot of people want simplistic solutions, and they want feel-good solutions. So then we talk about feeling good, looking good, being perceived as doing good and moving forward. These all being actually quite... It's difficult to challenge that, but they're obstacles, right? That tend to not address the depth of the problem. At UBC, we have a climate emergency declaration that has been issued by the students themselves. And the students are saying, please don't infantilize us. Please help us grow up and address this problem with all its complexities and difficulties, right? But it's interesting that for many faculty members, it is unimaginable not to give students hope, and we're worried about despair. We don't know how to deal with our own shit. That's why we don't know pedagogically how to address the climate crisis in a different way. But yeah, it is a difficult pedagogical call, and I agree that in certain circumstances, dealing with difficult, uncomfortable conversations in a context, for example, where there's already a mental health crisis might not be the best approach, but we have to find a way of issuing a wider invitation for people to become buffalo and to grow up. And yeah, this is another thing that the collective is wrestling with. And this is another of the cartographies that we use. We call it a cartography 2. It's the image of Justitia, the Western Goddess of Justice by James Gauchiot, and of course there are problematic gendered and ableist representations here. We still use it though as art to show that there's not going to be perfect art. We will have to work with imperfect things and point out to the problems, right? So Justitia was created to show the relationships between the so-called first world and the so-called third world. And then you have Justitia saying, I'm sitting on the back of a man, he's sinking under the burden, I would do anything to help him except stepping down from his back. Here again, the relationships of power and the economic relationships are portrayed so that we can dig deeper into this and understand that more policies or just different kinds of charity or development are not gonna be able to tackle the core of the situation. And speaking of shit, we also have a cartography of shit. So you have, on the one hand, collective and individual shit in the house foundation, not allowing it to compost it. And then you have practices of unconditional acceptance and healing coming from sometimes meditation practices, yoga practices, or the practices of the communities, the indigenous communities we work with. And generally, we are kind of like sitting at the top of the pile of shit and saying, I can't do anything with the pile of shit, I don't know how to compost. And when we find these other practices, generally we use these other practices to escape from the collective shit. So here we're thinking about people who want to meditate their way out of this or do yoga out of this. And yoga and meditation are important, but they are important for frame 3, for us to be able to look at the shit and then be able to do the work that will allow the shit to be composted. So we're working a lot with this, with the sense that yes, we need to expand our capacities, but once we do, we also need to reorient our compass back to doing the work with the shit. Otherwise, part of us will just want to escape and feel good again, feel good, look good, and feel like you are doing something when we're actually just like in doing yoga or meditation. The self-care industry is only contributing to your entitlements again. Right? So instead of consuming these things, we say these things are important for sure, but they're important as long as they help us do the difficult work that needs to be done, the work that is uncomfortable. In themselves, they can also be just consumed and create escapist route away from the shit. We also look at the communities we work with to try to amplify their ideas about what lies beyond the house, right? What lies what could happen when the house is gone. So we talk about horizons of hope set beyond what is imaginable within modernity. So we're talking about what is generally unimaginable, right? So we're looking for examples of modern forms of examples of organizations, for example, within communities that go beyond modern forms of social economy. In modern forms of social economy, we're talking about capitalism, socialism, and anarchism. We are also thinking about relationships that go beyond nation states and borders as mediators of relations, that go beyond the separation between man and nature, which is anthropocentrism associated with patriarchy and separability, that go beyond the single rationality and story of progress, development, and evolution, that go beyond social mobility as the purpose of life, and that go beyond consumption of goods, knowledge, relationships, experiences, and even critique as a mode of relating to the world. And I would like just to finish with a few slides about the collective itself. Here is a kind of a hub that we have of communities in Latin America, both in Peru and in Brazil, where we have our gatherings. I'm going to one in a week it's called Teia das Cinco Curas. This was a gathering in Fortaleza in Brazil in 2019. Then we have the Unbecoming Modernity Collective. This is a collective of students. It's also a hub within the bigger collective. They organize events with artists and scholars about the end of the world as we know it, which is not the end of the world, period. It's the end of a way of being and knowing and hoping in the world. We also work with the community here in Canada, the Indigenous community in the Kainai Reservation, and we run residencies there. This is the residency called In Earth's Care, and was also happening, this photo from last year, but we've been doing that for the last 6. And here are some questions I would like to finish with that come that are questions from the collective, but we have paired them with murals from the Cheran community in Mexico. For those of you who don't know, Cheran in Mexico had an uprising in 2011. I really encourage you to look for the whole story on the internet. But basically, they are at the forefront of trying to reimagine relationships beyond the nation state, beyond capitalism, beyond, and also health, indigenous health and education in ways that are not controlled by the state. So we're working with some people from there, and yeah, I think the murals already say a lot. The mural photographs that were painted during the uprising already say a lot about our gesture towards what is the problem and what may be possible once we go through the storm together. So the first question is, how has modernity, including its internal critique, trapped us in conceptualizations, relationships, and experiences that restrict our horizons of possibility, or what we consider to be possible, intelligible, and imaginable? This other mural speaks to the question, what limits what's possible for us to sense, to want, and to imagine? How has being, our existence, been reduced to knowing? How has the obsession with meaning overcoded our senses? This mural speaks to the question, what beyond moral convictions can offer an antidote to indifference? And how can we relate beyond knowledge, identity, and understanding? How can we engage and be taught by different systems of knowledge and being, struggles and attempts to create alternatives, acutely aware of their gifts, limitations, ignorances, and contradictions, as well as our own projections, idealizations, and instrumentalizations? What kind of education can override our categorical and neurological wiring, activate a visceral sense of entanglement and responsibility, and open up possibilities or worlds that are viable but unimaginable or inarticulable within our current frames of reference, the box of Box had? This is interesting because part of the collective is also looking at how what we believe is only thinking is actually a physiological configuration. So modern societies are more dopamine based, whereas other societies may be more serotonin based. So it's a physiological thing rather than only a thinking thing. And that challenges the idea that, okay, if we just sit together with values and agree on the values, we'll get to a better place. What we think is already grounded on how we feel about things in certain neurobiological circuits, neurochemical, neurofunctional circuits. Unless these circuits are interrupted, you may be using the same words, but you will act out of that desires. Some of these desires are harmful, some of them are insecurities. So when people are acting from their insecurities, it doesn't matter what they say here. The drive behind it is what matters. So Gayatri Spivak, who is one of the authors that we use, as inspiration for the project, says that education should be about an uncoercive rearrangement of desires, so an interruption of harmful desires, so that we can reallocate our desires in a more generative way. And this involves the unconscious, this involves the body, this involves the physiology that we have, the affective side, right? And we have been treating our modern physiology as a form of addiction. It's very, very difficult to interrupt, and it can't be interrupted, or very rarely it can be interrupted only with the intellect. There's other work that needs to be done, and we're interested in that. And here you have the last one. How can we hospice a dying way of knowing and being and assist with the birth of something new, still fragile, undefined, and potentially, but not necessarily, wiser, with radical tenderness? Radical tenderness is the title of a series of body movements that artist Dani D'Emilia has created and adapted together with the collective. We have also on the website something about that if you're interested in digging deeper in the area of the body. I would like to just finish by telling you about a few things that we have on the website. One of them is the booklet, GCE Otherwise, Global Citizenship Education Otherwise. This was created for a group of educators in Europe involved in global education, who wanted something from the collective to ground their work. There's a study program inside of it. Some of the cartographies are also in it. You will have, for example, the house modernity built in here, and this is downloadable for free from the website. We also have a set of questions that were developed for an event, a conference that happened here, and we had some funding to do that. So there is a set of cards that we have to support this work that can also be found on the website. You can find the questions on the website, but you'd have to order this from the US, which is the company that makes the actual cards. There's also a book called Towards Braiding, which is a book about Indigenous and settler relationships in Canada. And there are many other blog posts and podcasts, and sometimes you will also find opportunities for immersion programs with us in Europe. Generally we do that in Slovenia because there's a place there that we can use, but also in Brazil, sometimes in Canada, and we always post the announcements there. So if this kind of work speaks to you, you're very welcome to just have a look at the materials on the website, see how you feel, how you respond, and get in contact if you feel that that's something that you need to do, if you want to hang out with us. So thank you again for watching the video. I'm sorry I can't be there in body, but I hope we will see each other again soon.